The autumn of 1885 in Millerville, Texas, was a time when the social order seemed as fixed and immutable as the red clay soil that stretched across the prairie. It was a place where a man's worth was measured not by his character or accomplishments, but by the color of his skin and the circumstances of his birth. For most of the town's 800 residents, this hierarchy was simply the natural order of things, as unchangeable as the sunrise and as unquestionable as Scripture itself. But on the morning of October 15, 1885, that order would be challenged in a way that no one in Millerville could have imagined, by a man whose very presence in their community defied every assumption they held about what was possible in the post-Civil War South. Elijah Washington Freeman was 34 years old, though the responsibilities he had shouldered since childhood had given him the bearing and wisdom of a much older man. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor, Elijah possessed a quiet dignity that commanded respect from those willing to see past the color of his skin. His dark eyes held an intelligence and determination that had been forged in the crucible of adversity, and his carefully maintained appearance reflected a pride that no amount of prejudice had been able to break. Born into slavery on a cotton plantation in Mississippi, Elijah had gained his freedom at the age of 14 when Union forces liberated his family's plantation in 1865. Unlike many former slaves who remained in the South as sharecroppers or drifted north in search of opportunities, Elijah had headed west with nothing but an iron will and an unshakable belief that a man could make something of himself if he was willing to work hard enough and smart enough to overcome any obstacle. For 20 years, Elijah had labored tirelessly to build something that most people believed was impossible for a man of his race: genuine wealth and independence. He had worked as a ranch hand, a trail driver, a buffalo hunter, and anything else that would pay an honest wage. Every dollar he earned was carefully saved and invested, first in land, then in cattle, and eventually in a network of business ventures that stretched across 3 states. By 1885, Elijah Washington Freeman owned 4,000 acres of prime grazing land in Kansas, a successful freight business that operated between Dodge City and Denver, and investments in silver mines, real estate, and cattle operations throughout the West. His personal wealth was estimated at over $50,000, making him one of the richest men in the Kansas Territory, regardless of race. But wealth and success had not insulated Elijah from the harsh realities of racial prejudice that still defined much of American society. Even in the relatively progressive territories of the West, he encountered constant reminders that many white Americans viewed him as inferior, dangerous, or simply out of place. Banks were reluctant to do business with him, hotels refused him service, and social circles remained firmly closed to a man of his background, no matter how successful he became. It was this ongoing struggle against prejudice that had brought Elijah to Millerville, Texas, on that fateful October morning. He had come to town for the bankruptcy auction of the Double Circle Ranch, one of the largest and most prestigious cattle operations in East Texas. The ranch's owner, Colonel Augustus Whitmore, had built his reputation not only as a successful cattleman, but also as one of the most vocal and influential advocates for white supremacy in the region. Colonel Whitmore was a man whose very existence seemed designed to embody every aspect of the old Southern aristocracy that the Civil War had supposedly destroyed. At 62 years old, he maintained the bearing and mannerisms of antebellum nobility, complete with a carefully waxed mustache, expensive clothes that were always immaculately maintained, and a manner of speaking that dripped with condescension toward anyone he considered his social inferior. Before the war, Whitmore had owned over 200 slaves and operated one of the largest cotton plantations in Texas. When the Confederacy fell and slavery was abolished, he had refused to accept the new reality, instead devoting his considerable energy and resources to maintaining white supremacy through other means. He had been a founding member of several organizations dedicated to intimidating and controlling the newly freed black population, and his ranch had become an unofficial headquarters for like-minded individuals throughout East Texas. The Double Circle Ranch itself was a monument to Whitmore's vision of proper social order. Spanning nearly 8,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the region, the operation supported over 1,500 head of prime Texas longhorn cattle and employed 30 full-time cowboys, all of them white. The ranch house was a palatial two-story mansion that had been designed to rival the grandest plantation homes of the Old South, complete with massive columns, expansive verandas, and furnishings that had been imported from Europe at enormous expense. But for all its grandeur and success, the Double Circle Ranch had fallen victim to the same economic forces that had destroyed many agricultural enterprises in the post-war South. A combination of falling cattle prices, mounting debts, poor investment decisions, and Colonel Whitmore's refusal to adapt to changing market conditions had gradually eroded the financial foundation of his empire. When the bank finally called in his loans in September 1885, Whitmore found himself facing complete financial ruin. The announcement of the bankruptcy auction had attracted buyers from across Texas and beyond, drawn by the opportunity to acquire one of the most valuable properties in the state at what was expected to be a fraction of its true worth. Among the potential bidders were several wealthy ranchers, a syndicate of investors from Dallas, and representatives of a Chicago-based cattle company looking to expand their operations into Texas. What none of them expected was to find themselves competing against a well-dressed black man who arrived in town driving an expensive carriage and accompanied by a lawyer from Kansas City. Elijah's presence at the auction caused an immediate stir among the white residents of Millerville, most of whom had never seen a black man who wasn't either working as a laborer or clearly in a position of subservience. The initial reaction from the townspeople ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Many assumed that Elijah was some kind of servant or representative of a white buyer who had chosen to remain anonymous. Others speculated that he was involved in some sort of confidence scheme designed to disrupt the auction. But as word spread that Elijah was registered as a legitimate bidder with the financial credentials to back up his intentions, the atmosphere in town grew increasingly tense. Colonel Whitmore's reaction to Elijah's presence was immediate and volcanic. When informed that a Negro was planning to bid on his beloved ranch, Whitmore flew into a rage that could be heard throughout the hotel where he was staying. He demanded that the auctioneer bar Elijah from participating, threatened to file lawsuits to prevent the sale, and made several public statements that left no doubt about his feelings regarding the possibility of a black man owning his life's work. "I would rather see the Double Circle burned to the ground than sold to some uppity Negro who doesn't know his place," Whitmore declared to anyone within earshot. "This is still Texas, and there are some things that will not be tolerated, no matter what the law might say." But despite Whitmore's protests and the obvious discomfort of many townspeople, the auction proceeded as scheduled. Texas law was clear that any person with the financial means to participate in a legal auction could not be barred based on race, and the court-appointed auctioneer was determined to conduct the sale according to proper legal procedures. The auction itself was a tense affair that drew nearly the entire population of Millerville to the courthouse square. Elijah sat quietly in the front row, ignoring the hostile stares and whispered comments from the crowd around him. He had brought with him detailed financial records, letters of credit from banks in Kansas and Colorado, and all the documentation necessary to prove that he was a serious buyer with the resources to complete any purchase he might make. As the bidding began, it quickly became apparent that Elijah was not merely a curiosity seeker or someone looking to make a statement. He bid aggressively and intelligently, demonstrating a thorough knowledge of the ranch's value and capabilities. When other bidders dropped out as the price climbed higher, Elijah continued to raise his hand, apparently unconcerned by the mounting cost. The tension in the crowd grew palpable as it became clear that Elijah was likely to win the auction. Colonel Whitmore, who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror, finally stood up and began shouting at the auctioneer, demanding that the sale be stopped and threatening violence if it continued. "This is an abomination!" Whitmore screamed, his face red with rage and humiliation. "I will not stand by and watch 20 years of my life's work handed over to some ignorant field hand who probably can't even read the deed." The auctioneer, a nervous man from Dallas who was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, tried to maintain order while continuing the bidding process. Local law enforcement, consisting of a sheriff and 2 deputies who were obviously sympathetic to Colonel Whitmore's position, made no effort to control the increasingly hostile crowd. But Elijah remained calm throughout the disturbance, sitting quietly with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. When the final bid was called and the hammer fell, The courthouse square erupted in a mixture of shocked silence and angry murmurs. Elijah Washington Freeman had purchased the Double Circle Ranch for the sum of $28,000, making him the new owner of one of the most prestigious properties in East Texas. The immediate aftermath of the auction was chaotic and potentially dangerous. Colonel Whitmore had to be physically restrained from attacking Elijah, and several groups of angry white men gathered in the street to discuss what they saw as an intolerable situation. There were open threats of violence, talk of forming vigilante groups to restore order, and suggestions that Elijah should be driven out of town before he could take possession of his purchase. But Elijah had not survived and prospered for 20 years by being naive about the realities of racial hostility. He had come to Millerville prepared for exactly this kind of reaction, and he had taken precautions that demonstrated both his intelligence and his determination to see his plans through to completion. Within hours of winning the auction, a train arrived in Millerville carrying 20 armed men who had been hired by Elijah to provide security during the transition period. These were not ordinary gunmen, but experienced professionals who had worked for mining companies, railroad corporations, and other businesses that operated in dangerous territories. Their presence sent a clear message that Elijah was serious about protecting his investment and his right to take possession of the property he had legally purchased. More importantly, Elijah had brought with him legal documentation that revealed the true scope of his intentions. The purchase of the Double Circle Ranch was not an end in itself, but rather the centerpiece of a much larger business plan that would transform not only the ranch, but the entire economic landscape of the region. Over the following days, as Elijah took possession of the ranch and began implementing his plans, the people of Millerville discovered that their new neighbor was unlike anything they had expected. Rather than simply taking over the existing operation, Elijah announced a complete reorganization of the ranch that would create opportunities for both white and black workers, introduce new agricultural techniques, and establish the Double Circle as a hub for progressive business practices. The first shock came when Elijah announced that he would be retaining all of the ranch's existing white employees, offering them not only continued employment, but improved wages and working conditions. This decision flew in the face of expectations that he would fire all the white workers and replace them with black laborers, and it forced many people to reconsider their assumptions about his motivations and character. The second surprise was Elijah's treatment of Colonel Whitmore himself. Rather than simply evicting the former owner and enjoying his humiliation, Elijah made an offer that stunned everyone who heard it. He invited Whitmore to remain on the ranch as a paid consultant, acknowledging the man's expertise in cattle ranching while making it clear that the days of racial discrimination were over. "Colonel Whitmore," Elijah said during a public meeting in the town square, "you may hate me because of the color of my skin, but I respect your knowledge of this land and these cattle. I'm offering you the chance to continue working with something you've spent your life building, under new management that judges men by their abilities rather than their ancestry." The offer was unprecedented in the post-Civil War South, where racial conflicts were typically resolved through violence, intimidation, or complete separation. Never before had a black man in a position of power offered partnership to a white supremacist who had publicly expressed hatred and contempt for his race. Colonel Whitmore's initial reaction was predictable. He rejected the offer with venomous hostility, declaring that he would rather starve than work for a black man. But as the days passed and the reality of his financial situation became clear, Whitmore found himself facing a choice between his pride and his survival. The transformation of the Double Circle Ranch under Elijah's ownership proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency. New facilities were constructed to improve the living conditions of all workers, modern equipment was purchased to increase productivity, and innovative breeding programs were established to improve the quality of the cattle herd. Most importantly, Elijah instituted a profit-sharing program that gave all employees, regardless of race, a stake in the ranch's success. The results were dramatic and undeniable. Within 6 months, the Double Circle Ranch was producing more cattle and generating more revenue than it had ever achieved under Colonel Whitmore's management. The improved working conditions and fair treatment of employees had created a level of loyalty and dedication that translated directly into increased productivity and profitability. More significantly, the success of Elijah's approach began to attract attention from throughout the region. Other ranchers, initially skeptical of his methods, began to visit the Double Circle to see for themselves how a racially integrated workforce could be more effective than traditional segregated operations. Business leaders from Dallas and Houston came to study Elijah's management techniques, and several major investors expressed interest in funding similar operations elsewhere in Texas. The impact on Millerville itself was equally profound. The increased economic activity generated by the ranch's success brought new businesses to town, created jobs for both white and black residents, and generated tax revenue that funded improvements to schools, roads, and public facilities. For the first time in years, the town was growing and prospering rather than struggling to survive. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was the gradual change in Colonel Whitmore himself. Faced with the undeniable evidence of Elijah's success and the growing prosperity that surrounded him, Whitmore found his worldview challenged in ways he had never imagined possible. The black man he had dismissed as an ignorant field hand had proven to be a more capable businessman and leader than Whitmore had ever been. The turning point came 8 months after the auction, when a group of night riders attempted to burn down the ranch's new facilities and drive Elijah out of the area. The attack was repelled by the security force that Elijah maintained, but during the confrontation, Colonel Whitmore surprised everyone by standing with the defenders rather than supporting the attackers. "These buildings represent honest work and fair dealing," Whitmore declared to the would-be raiders. "I may not like everything that's happened here, but I won't stand by and watch good work destroyed by cowards who hide behind masks." The failed attack marked a turning point, not only for Colonel Whitmore but for the entire community. The sight of the former Confederate colonel defending a black-owned enterprise sent a powerful message about the possibility of change and redemption, even among those who had seemed most committed to the old ways. Over the following months, Whitmore gradually accepted Elijah's offer to serve as a consultant, bringing his knowledge of local conditions and cattle management to bear in service of the ranch's continued success. The partnership between the two men, impossible to imagine just a year earlier, became a symbol of what could be achieved when mutual respect replaced racial hatred. The success of the Double Circle Ranch under Elijah's ownership eventually attracted national attention, with newspapers and magazines sending reporters to document this unprecedented example of successful racial cooperation in the post-Civil War South. The story of the black cowboy who purchased his former enemy and transformed him into an ally became a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing assumptions about the impossibility of racial harmony. But for Elijah Washington Freeman, the true measure of success was not the national recognition or the financial profits, but the knowledge that he had proven something important about human nature and the possibility of change. He had demonstrated that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome through patience, fairness, and the simple act of treating all people with dignity and respect. Years later, when Colonel Whitmore was asked by a visiting journalist how he felt about working for a black man, the old Confederate's response would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "I was wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I was never more wrong than when I thought a man's worth was determined by the color of his skin. Elijah Freeman is the finest man I've ever known, and I'm proud to work with him." The Double Circle Ranch continued to prosper under the partnership between Elijah and Whitmore, becoming one of the most successful and innovative cattle operations in the Southwest. More importantly, it served as a living example of what America could become when its citizens chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over hatred, and justice over prejudice. And on quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the two men sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, they would sometimes reflect on the remarkable journey that had brought them from bitter enemies to trusted partners, and on the power of one man's decision to respond to hatred with dignity, to prejudice with fairness, and to ignorance with the patient demonstration of a better way.